Hello and welcome to 2-Rail O-Scale 2017. I'm your host, Terry Terrance. In each one of these videos, we try to dispel a myth associated with O-Scale. In this video, we're going to dispel the myth that is illustrated by this slide, that O-Scale layouts are scenically challenged. Most people believe that after laying track and getting trains running, O-Scalers tend to stop building. Even some O-Scalers tend to believe this myth. You're going to see 4 layouts that illustrate what can be accomplished scenically in O-Scale. A few of these layouts are nearly complete, and one is still a building. In each case, you'll see spectacular scenery that, in many cases, is made with common materials. So sit back and enjoy 2-Rail O-Scale 2017. Tucked into one end of a basement in Indiana is Warner Clark's nickel plate layout. Warner has created a detailed 2-level layout featuring both mainline running and street running, continuous operation, and point-to-point operation. He's done this using, largely, commercial kits and supplies, saving his craftsmanship for hand-laid track. As I was editing his audio interview, I realized that neither he nor I mentioned the layout is Proto 48, as indeed it is. Let's listen to Warner describe his layout. Warner, thank you for letting us tour your layout. Can you tell us what is the theme of your layout?
Basically, it's my childhood, where I grew up in the Midwest. Everything was flat, and we had to celebrate flatness. Basically, there are 3 different railroads, although there are four modeled. The 3 basic ones are the NKP, which is the Steam Road level line, and the DT&I, and line to the upper tier is the Ohio and Morenci Railroad, former interurban line that's now a diesel-operated freight line. Time period is 1945 through 1955 for that decade. Geographical location is northwest Ohio, southeastern Michigan. What had been an electric interurban line is now small diesel, 4-axle diesel. It's a transition period, and then on the steam road I have both steam and diesels. Operational concept is the steam road is a loop railroad, and the short line, former interurban, now a short line, is a point-to-point operation. Two objectives in the layout. Steam railroad is a level loop layout that you can sit in an easy chair and just watch the trains run all day. If you want to get a little more involved, then you go to the graded layout, the former interurban. That's a point-to-point layout, and I have specific customers on that need to ship and receive the cars that end up on the loop nickel plate DT&I.
Your layout is scenically complete. How long has it been under construction?
We bought the house in 1990, had it built. We had the basement here, decided around 1998 I better get cracking on the layout. So it's been about 20 years, 18 of real years of involvement and 2 years of slacking off. It's basically a shelf layout. It runs on 3 walls of the basement. I try to keep everything to well-constructed grids on 6 or 7 feet in length, 8 feet at max, against the wall. I want to be able to reach the furthest track without doing handstand or layout devices. But 19 feet in one direction and 26 feet in the other direction. It's an L-shaped layout. I use number 10 frogs in one area of the steam road, which is level. I use 10 frogs and 8 frogs and transitional curves. 64 inches transitional and 60 inches there's no lateral, no transition. Build on 2 layers of homosote. I like a wide 20-foot road bed. I'm in the process of converting to DCC from variable direct current. and that's a learning process in its own. Structures and rolling stock, I buy primarily kits. Same thing on locomotives. If I can't find the kit, I'll end up scratch building it myself, although I prefer to buy a model in a box.
Warner, can you tell us about how you constructed the scenery on your layout? Do you have any scenic techniques or secrets that you want to share?
Being basically a shelf layout, I photographed a number of scenes from our area. And of course, being here in the Midwest, everything's either corn or soybeans, so I don't have any mountains to worry about. Taken them to photo finishers and expanded them out to a scale that matches O gauge, 4 feet to the inch. So I tell the photographer or the Photoshop to make that picture at the base 1 inch wide for every 4 feet, and that's my scale. I cut the photographs. I cut everything above the horizon line, tree line out, because I painted the walls an atmospheric blue. Two things I don't do are clouds and telegraph wires. It's just way beyond my ability to keep my balance without getting strung up in it. The scenery itself, basically trees wherever I can find them, and they look decent. My associate, Rich Beaujolais, he knows how to make a tree out of weeds. Woodland Scenics and Scenic Express are the two primary suppliers, although I have used some others. And roadbeds 4 inches wide. I use nickel silver rail. I start out on the interurban line as being code 100, or roughly 60 or 70 pound rail. I get up into the street brick section of Morenci, and then I go to girder rail, which is 148. I've made my own transition, and you don't have to worry about a compromised joint. But all the track is hand laid, 4 spikes to a cross tie. I like the wide roadbed and transitional curves and the long frogs. The steam road, which is level, no grades, all uses 8s or 10s, very few 6s. And the interurban line uses a 6 frog and a 9 frog, although I have a lot of single point switches in street running there in Morenci.
You have a lot of scenic detail in a small area. Does this make the layout feel bigger?
I think perhaps it may do so, but it's really up to the viewer if he's attracted to it or not. It all represents my growing up in a small town in the Midwest, and the various locations I live. I chose Morenci because it's a small town, about 2,000 population, and my aunt, uncle, and my uncle's father lived and worked there, and what fascinated the devil out of me was they had a railroad that ran right down the center of their street, Main Street, which happened to be a former interurban line, but when I knew it, it was a freight line, and of course that's a big part of my layout. I grew up in a town on the lake shore in Michigan Southern, New York Central, and my roundhouse and Indian terminal represents that part of my life. And the people that worked there became my idols. They taught me how to fire steam engine and throw switches. And the only time I was told to stay away was when the management came to town, which wasn't all that often.
So, Warner, did those experiences lead to your career with the railroad?
Well, my initial railroad job was an extra board clerk for the nickel plate in Indiana. And while I was going to college, and on the EJ&E in Chicago for a short time. Most of my career was with the New York Central, Penn Central, Conrail, and I retired from the TPNW, semi-retired, I guess, retired twice, and total of about 41 years working in the industry, but primarily office in marketing, sales. not in operations.
Warner, thank you so very much for letting us tour your layout today.
Well, thanks for coming.
On each of these videos, we try to present something unusual in O scale. In central New Jersey, Tom Picarillo has built a Somerset County traction system, a freight hauling traction line operated from overhead wire and featuring marine operations. Tom's basement filling layout shows that you can get good operation from trolley wire in O scale. Let's listen as Tom tells the story of the Somerset County traction system. Tom, thank you for inviting us to see your layout. Can you tell us the story of the Somerset County traction system?
The Somerset County traction system is a model of a could-have-been mostly freight hauling railroad. The line traverses north-central New Jersey, from the eastern boundaries Edgewater in Newark Bay to the western boundaries Edgewater on the Delaware River, and represents a distance of about 49 miles. The time period is late summer 1957, and trains are powered by an overhead wire system delivering 600 volts DC via pantographs mounted atop the locomotives, called motors on this railroad and on many other traction lines. Traffic arrives and leaves the main line at 5 points, 2 by car float at the water's edge, 1 by interchange with the Easton and Amboy Railroad, which was the Lehigh Valley Railroad's line through New Jersey, in the midpoint of the railroad at Boundbrook, a connection with the Rahway Valley Railroad in Aldine, and 1 from the branch line to Neshannock, which emanates from Lambertville. Even though this line operates at an uneven pace, typical of other short lines in the area, such as the Rahway Valley and the Morristown and Erie, the service is first-rate. Service is provided to the central New Jersey towns of Elizabethport, Aldine, Fanwood, Warrenville, Round Top, Martinsville, Chimney Rock, Calco, Bound Brook, Raritan, Lambertville, and Neshannock. Equipment can be described as anything from brand new to rebuilt cast-offs from other lines, but all are in fine shape, even if appearing a little grubby at times. There are a few scheduled passenger trains. All freight trains are extras. Freight train conductors must keep a sharp eye on the clock to make sure their trains don't interfere with passenger operations. Passenger trains may consist of only a single interurban type car, or may include several cars and a motor. In either case, passenger train must be turned at each end of the line to get the consist in order, and to turn the diner, if so equipped, in the correct direction of travel so the roof vents operate correctly. In Fanwood on the east end, a turntable is used. In Lambertville on the west end, a scissors Y leading to the Neshannock branch is used to turn trains around. Between passenger trains, local freights make their way east and west, picking up and setting out cars as directed by 4-cycle waybills. Train crews perform their own local switching, except in Boundbrook, where the local operator takes charge. Bill boxes on the railroad have the waybills and car cards sorted by their required direction of travel. No flipping of waybills is required. Pickup cars are in the front of the bill box. Cards for setouts are filed in the rear of the middle box. Due to restrictions of the physical plant, maximum train length is a motor plus 6 cars plus a caboose. The caboose may be placed anywhere in the train, but at the rear is preferred. All deliveries are local. Trains are not classified by destination. Each conductor must remember to stop his train and call the dispatcher from every telephone on the railroad to report his location, even if he has received authorization in advance to travel to distant towns. In addition, if local switching exceeds 5 minutes, real time, the conductor must call the dispatcher to check for updated instructions. Track switches are all manually set by hand-operated ground throws. The normal position of the switch is indicated by a green indication on the handle, and red indicates reverse. All switches must be returned to the normal position before leaving a section of track. Otherwise, following crews are at risk of accident. When approaching the terminal yards of Fanwood and Lambertville, attention is paid to the home signal at the yard limit. The yardmaster sets his signal to either allow or prohibit entry to his yard. When a crew has left the main line, they call the dispatcher and advise him they are off the railroad. For passenger operation, the clock is set at a speed that is 4 times normal, so a sminute, or a scale minute, takes about 15 seconds real time. For freight-only operation, there is no need for a clock. The interchanges in Fanwood and Boundbrook between the overhead-powered Somerset County traction system and the 2-rail-powered Easton and Amboy Steam Railroad and Rahway Valley Diesel Line require special wiring and electrical switches. To allow the operation of 2-rail equipment under the overhead wire, no motor must occupy the track when the track is set to operate 2-rail equipment, otherwise the railroad will short out. The car float makes its appearance when traffic requires it to do so. Yardmasters typically load and unload the float, and they must remember to avoid an imbalance of more than one car when doing so. Otherwise, the car float may capsize. The working float is mounted on a movable cart and sets sail to other parts of the basement between dockings. The 30-inch gauge Harder-Felsen quarry train makes its way back and forth from crusher to transfer station automatically. Train speeds are as follows. Yards, 10 miles per hour maximum. Freight trains, 25 miles per hour. Passenger trains, 40 miles per hour. And across the trestle, all trains, 10 miles per hour maximum.
You have a great layout completed to a high level of detail. How long has your layout been under construction?
Construction of the 32-foot by 40-foot layout was started in January of 2001, and the layout is now fully functional and fully scenic. The benchwork uses L-girder construction, and scenery is plaster over plaster cloth over cardboard strips. Trees are a mixture of those commercially available and homemade. Structures are a mixture of scratch-built and kits. The layout includes a complete backdrop that I painted myself from one end of the railroad to the other. All track switches on the railroad are hand-laid. The connecting tracks are micro-engineering code 100 on the traction line and code 148 on the Easton and Amboy. Track is laid over foam roadbed and ballasted with patio paver polymeric gray sand, which is self-adhering once wetted. All track is painted and weathered before ballast is applied.
O-scale traction is not something you're likely to see in your local hobby shop. What is your roster like, and where did you acquire it?
The rolling stock is equipment I have acquired during my participation in this hobby since 1964. I rebuild all my motors to include smooth running mechanisms, most with flywheels and many with sound. The overhead wire is supported by 3/16 diameter steel poles that are threaded into the plywood subroad bed and secured with machine nuts. I use 24 gauge, 20 thousandths diameter, half-hard phosphor bronze wire coated with Neolube graphite lubricant to avoid trouble with electrical contact with the pantograph shoes. Power and control are supplied by an NCE DCC system, and all track and equipment conforms to NMRA specifications for trouble-free operation. The telephone system was constructed using old Western Electric home telephones adapted to party line use. The dispatcher wears a headset and can instantly hear anyone calling him. When he needs to reach a crew out on the line, he sets a switch on his panel to illuminate a red light located next to the phone box out on the railroad and rings a trolley gong to alert crews that he is calling. The railroad is operated twice a month by a crew that typically includes 12 to 14 of the 21-man call list. Each session lasts about 2 hours, after which coffee and donuts are served, while members show and tell about their latest projects.
What attracted you to model a freight hauling traction railroad?
My inspiration came from my many visits to the O-Scale Central New Jersey Model Railroad Association's club in Westfield, New Jersey in the late 1960s and early 1970s. At the club, there was a group of very neat guys who were operating O-Scale trains from overhead wire, and I thought it was really neat that the power for these models was installed right on the trucks themselves, rather than trying to cram them inside the locomotives or the motors like in HO models. The club layout was designed principally as a display layout. Trains ran from here to there for the pleasure of a crowd witnessing them during the annual shows on Thanksgiving and Christmas weekends. But afterwards, I experienced some true model railroad operation at local layouts here in New Jersey and decided that I should incorporate freight train operation into the concept for my new model railroad. So I did a lot of research on electric freight train operations and found myself mostly interested in the operations provided by the Piedmont Northern Railway in North and South Carolina and the Sacramento Northern Railway in California. Since I'm interested in all kinds of equipment, I decided that a freelance railroad would allow me to build the kinds of traction equipment that interested me at the time, and so I didn't want to get nailed down to any specific prototype. The selection of O-scale traction has been completely satisfactory to my model building skills, and I would do it again in an instant. One of the neat things about traction equipment is it comes in all shapes, sizes, colors, and materials, and that gave me an excellent opportunity to build whatever struck my fancy at the time. The freight motors and passenger equipment have been built from kits, from scratch, from junk picked up at flea markets, and one of my favorite parts of the hobby is rebuilding a junker into something of a really classic model. I scratch build my own power trucks, most of them with flywheels, so I get really smooth performance, and I have a paint booth that I spray paint all the equipment in, and I like to give everything a nice coat of weathering so it looks highly realistic. So visitors to my layout will see anything from tiny four-wheeled industrial switchers with a huge pantograph on top to giant 16-wheeled motors with two pantographs on top, hauling anywhere from one car to perhaps 12 cars in a standard freight train. You'll find work motors, steeple cabs, box motors, interurbans. A few streetcars sneak in here and there. All new, all old, all detailed. Whatever I like to do at the time. It's a lot of fun.
Your layout seems to be scenically complete. What are some of the scenic features of your layout?
New Jersey is called the Garden State, and for good reason. And first-time visitors to New Jersey find out that it isn't the barren wasteland of industrial complexes and used car lots that they're led to believe. By traveling as little as 15 miles west of Newark, they come to rolling hills and quiet countrysides. My railroad tries to depict that section of New Jersey that I love so much. I've used many materials to duplicate this beautiful rolling countryside in New Jersey. But typically, construction starts with making a web of cardboard strips, which are stapled to the roadbed and to the backdrop. Over that, I lay on plaster-soaked cloth, like used for bandages, to provide a sub-base for the top coat of plaster that forms the basic soil. And then I add plaster cast rocks to that, which sometimes I cast in just aluminum foil molds. And then I tint them with craft paints, and later on a layer of glue and green and brown cloth to represent foliage.
Tom, your layout seems to lack nothing. What's in the future for your layout?
My to-do list has 3 major projects. The first one is to add more interior detailing and lighting in the structures. The second is I'd like to include more animations, such as rotating signs and crossing signals that alternately light, like the real ones. And the third one is to add additional car float destinations in remote areas of the layout basement, so that the car floats can actually go somewhere other than just back and forth to their original destinations that they have now.
Tom, thanks for the tour of your layout. In northern Indiana, Gary Engel has created a spectacular O-scale Great Northern layout. Gary's layout features scenery nearly to the floor in a couple of areas, and a pair of dramatic gorges, one with a 5-foot-long trestle and the other with 2 bridges on different levels. Gary has recreated stations from the Great Northern and has many, many highly detailed scenes. The layout also has an operating signal system featuring semaphore signals. Signals are indicative of a scenically advanced layout. Let's listen to Gary's story. Gary, thank you for letting us visit your layout. What's the theme of your layout?
The theme has always been built around the Great Northern Railroad. I have tried to take structures and scenes, bridges, snow sheds, different real structures, and incorporate them into the layout. I feel like that the scenery and the rocks and the mountains and stuff that come through the Great Northern area is just inviting to make your modeling and make a beautiful layout. I love to run the trains through all the scenery and the surprisingly the development of the buildings to fit the environment, which was Great Northern's theme.
Gary, how long has your layout been under construction and how big is it?
We built the house in 2000, and of course the layout room was part of the plan and was always the most important part to the whole house. The size is roughly 74 feet long by about 32 feet wide. The lighting, the ceilings, everything was thought through, no columns in the basement, and that was very important. And we had some windows out with good light coming in from outside windows, and which helped brighten the room up and make it more like a layout room, not a basement.
Gary, you modeled the Great Northern Railroad. So my question is, why the Great Northern? Why did you pick that railroad? And do you find it easy to model in O-scale?
I found that I had an interest in the Great Northern when I was in HO. I thought the colors, the scenery, the routes, interesting factors of how it went to certain towns and that. A lot of the just railroad things, such as the icing platforms, the cattle, grain. There was just a lot going on all the time, and it was always easy to model. But as I got more interested into it, met more people, joined the Great Northern Historical Society, I found that O-gauge was more inviting and more lend itself to being more of a modeler's haven, because it was just a lot of stuff available, a lot of good guys with knowledge, and a lot of engines. So that made it very, very easy to model in O-gauge.
You're a Great Northern modeler, so how many classes of Great Northern locomotives and other equipment do you have?
I'm like any other Great Northern modeler or modeler in general. Engines, engines, engines. We just love them. A lot of equipment is the more the merrier. I have 22 steam engines and about 5 different diesels. Some of them are bought and a couple of them are scratch built. I have in the big stuff, Arctics, I have an R2, N3, L1, which are big numbers. And then, of course, I have the Northerns, which were the S2. And I have the Mikes. I have an '08. I have a scratch-built '07 and a scratch-built '03. I have a H4, a couple H4s, which are the Pacifics. And then I also have a F8, which is scratch-built. And then I have the 460. And then I have a couple switchers. I have an 080 switcher, which is scratch-built, which is a C1. And in the diesels, I have the FTs, which pull my passenger trains. And then I have a NW5, which was scratch-built by a very good friend. Talented, super talented guy. And I have an RS1, which is a Chemtron kit. And then I have an SW1, which is by Precision Scale. That's more than enough to run all kinds of different routes on the Great Northern, pull different equipment, run oil trains, coal trains, cattle trains, and still make it look good. The bigger stuff, you need more cars. The nice Northerns, the Mikes, they can run with 20 cars and a nice caboose, and they look good. The stock cars, coal cars, flat cars, the more the merrier. Just love all those tank cars, and there's a lot of them out there. A lot of them you need to paint, a lot of them you need to decal correctly, but that's fun and part of the hobby.
What impresses one when you walk into your train room is the scenery. In many places, your scenery is nearly to the floor, which in O-scale makes it quite an expanse of scenery. You have hundreds of trees, you have rock formations that are very nicely colored, and these are things that most people find intimidating, and yet you seem to have pulled it off very well. Can you say a few things about that?
The scenery is really important in any layout. It's a backdrop for your models that you spend a lot of time on and that they run through, and you try to make them look as real as possible. The castings in that, a lot of that, you have to look at the area you're modeling. You try to see what formations and how they come up with the rocks and what colors they are and that. But the rocks, the more the merrier. If you can make it all the way to the floor, it just looks massive. Your train looks more in proportion, looks better in size. It just looks like it's in a distance. The castings, you can buy rock molds, which are very easy to use, and they're always developing stuff. Mine are plaster, just plain plaster of Paris, and I cast them. When they're wet, you apply them, and then you peel the mold off, and then you start to let them dry good, and start the coloring. And you can put them together for a whole section at one time before you start coloring them. And you can look at them, and you can carve them a little bit if you want to change them or give them a new direction. Put ledges in for trees. Lots of things can be done for your own personal touches and thoughts. The coloring of the rock is all done with acrylics. You want to do something on a light basis, where that you start out with a very, very light solution. And that's done by using a lot of water, and you use a small amount of the acrylic colorants. and you stir them in and get them dissolved well, and then a big brush. And you start at the top and you let it run down and you just work it into the grooves, and you keep going until you like the contrast of what you have. And by starting out light, you don't get into trouble then when it's dark, because it once it dries, you get a different look. But you can always go back and do a little more over the top of it. The other thing, the ground cover, the weeds, the trees, all that, of course, makes the rock look better. The trees, I have about 600 trees on the layout. A lot of weeds. I don't even know how many weeds. There's just hundreds and hundreds of weeds. The ground cover I make from different material like that I buy at Hobby Lobby. Comes in a bag. It's like a mulch. And then I put it in a blender, a food blender, which my wife doesn't know is missing. And then we grind it up, and that makes unbelievably great ground cover. And then, of course, you sprinkle that around the trees, out around the tracks, and then with the grass. And it all gives a three-dimensional look. And the trees always try to put a stump on the bottom of them. Just a piece of wood from out in your yard, a tree branch or something, drill a hole in it and stick it up on the wire on a tree. And that gives that tree more real look and more of a simple way to even fasten it to the table. And then dust around the bottom of it with dirt, and that makes it look nicer.
Your layout appears to be a very long string of very, very highly detailed scenes. You have very detailed structures, vehicles, and most of all, the thing that impressed me was your figures. Your figures have nice subdued colors. They don't have that plastic shine. And most importantly, their motion appears very lifelike, not like it was stunted or frozen in time. Can you say something about that?
Thank you for the nice comments. I really appreciate those. And I find myself agreeing that the feel of the realism and the soft look of the detailing parts make the scene come alive. The people issue, all the people are mounted on a little wire when you get them and stuff, most of them. And you can touch them up with paint and soften the colors real easy. And then fit them into the scene to be active and looking like that they're doing something, but not heavy stuff. But then after you get them ready to go, you take Krylon, which is a regular paint that you can get at any craft store, and it comes in a flat finish. And then you can spray each one with that, and you dull them down, and they look nice and soft. And, of course, then they fit in. I do that to my automobiles, trucks, to make them, again, look more realistic and more fitting into the scene. They're not really standing out like they're bold colors or anything. But all the structures and the weathering and the softness is what makes the scene come together.
Gary, you have a working signal system, which is a little bit unusual on a model railroad. Now, most model railroads, yours included, don't actually operate using the signals. So signals are an important part of your scenery. So I have a few questions. Number one, why did you pick semaphores? Number two, were they difficult to implement? Can you give us some of the details?
I found that the Great Northern had many railroad things that were used, and for a better word, I just call them things, but they were signaling, the catenary for the electrics, the telltales for the protection of the workers on the cars, and that. All of it seemed to add things to the interest in the line. I also made signs up, which I took from the Great Northern books, about the different things along the trackway, how far, what was there, what was ahead, and all kinds of warnings in that, and I thought that was all interesting. The signals, being the semaphore type, the Great Northern went to semaphores because of the weather and the snow. They are very interesting. They used a lot of different types of semaphores, a lot of 2 and 3 levered ones, and which were all that was really interesting. Very hard to reproduce. The ones that I used are driven by a little camera motor, which is in the bottom of them, and it has an electric eye on it, very small. And when the first car goes past it, it activates one either down the line or ahead of it, or in the back of it, and it changes as the last car goes by. And it works very well because I do use them because they have a couple hidden spots, and I can tell you where the train is by how the semaphore is positioned. The telltales are another super, I think, detailing part. They just look interesting. They look worn, hanging out there, but they were so important to protecting the people, the switchmen on the top of the cars and that. And again, it's just another piece of detail.
Gary, you have a lot of structures on your layout, so could you say whether they're kit-built, scratch-built, plastic, wood, what other materials are used? And while you're at it, let's talk about these very impressive trestles that you have. How did you build the trestles?
Wow. Structures are one of my favorite parts of the hobby. It's kind of like the scenery. I think you need those to make it all come together and look real. There's probably 5 or 6 big structures like the station, the icing platform, coaling facility, roundhouse, that a lot of that information came from the Great Northern Historical Society. A lot of the fellows had the plans, and you could scratch build them, which is how I got them done. And they're made out of all different types of materials. The roundhouse is all plaster castings, which I had one of the companies make for me, and they had to be cut and fitted, and the windows put in, and of course stained and painted. And but that's the only way you could get a Great Northern roundhouse. The same way with the station. The station is from Bellingham, Washington, and it's from the plans from the Historical Society, and it's just a beautiful station, all brick, stone, and just I think it's just spectacular looking. And the interior is done, and of course it's lighted. There was another lady in dollhouses that I saw at a show with her husband who was into trains, and she had made all these different castings to look like stone on buildings and that. And here's my station that I'm working on, and I had got to the front of the station, which was full of stone. And I talked to her for a while, and she explained what she did and how she did it. And I came home and practiced a little bit and was able to make my patterns and cast my stone. And of course, it was just fit in like a glove, and it really turned out beautiful. The icing station, they all came from certain spots, like it was from Whitefish Bay in Montana. And of course, scaled down, mine is roughly about 200 real feet, where the real one was probably about 3 miles, and it was huge. But just beautiful old wooden structure with the cables on it, pulling the ice up there, and those guys would take that ice and slide it over and put it in those reefers. And of course, shipping apples or whatever they had to move. Interesting. But then the other buildings and the other kits, there's just a lot of them that I saw that I liked. The majority of them are wood. I like working with wood because I can weather it, I can de-stress it, and soften the colors of it. There's an old gas station there, which has the texaco signs from the 30s that were copied off of a computer and put on the signboards. A couple different interlocking towers, they're wood also, and painted, and the green and that, but distressed. and all finished on the inside and lit too. But some of them, like there's a feed and grain elevator there on the layout, which is the Lionel kit. I took the Lionel kit and modified it and made it into a close to a Great Northern prototype, but not exactly. But it looks good. Sprayed it, weathered it, and softened it up, and it looks really nice. So the trestles is a whole nother story. Love bridges, love trestles. The trestles are all styrene, and I had a friend who was a rivet nut. And I met him when I was in Maumee, Ohio. And he had a sewing machine that he had converted to a machine that made rivet patterns. And that was he was just thrilled with that. He just made his rivets, and he loved rivets. So when I started on that trestle and started talking about it, I'm looking and I'm thinking, where am I going to get these rivet plates? How am I going to make these plates? Cut each one, drill it, put it together? No, that would take forever because the trestle is almost 5 feet long. And so anyway, he says, oh, don't worry about it. You get the styrene, I'll make the rivets. So I gave him the patterns, and he made the rivet plates. You cut them out, glued them on, and strips, and away we went. And it just turned out really beautiful. Weathered it, of course, and all of it put together with hot stuff. And decking and that made out of real wood, the ties and all, and plates, tie plates, nut and bolt detail up there. But a lot of work, but a beautiful, beautiful thing to see the train run across them.
So, Gary, what's in the future for your railroad?
Well, hopefully a lot of fun. As a layout gets built, it never gets finished. There's always places that you can detail and things you can add, things you can finesse, and to make it look better, and you kind of freshen it up a little bit. But as far as some of my interest, I have a couple projects, like I want to do an S1, which was a Northern that they use for a lot of freight. And then I have an 060 switcher, which I've been scratch building for. I had a friend who started it and then helped finish it a little bit. But that's been going on for a number of years. I'd like to finish that. Then I have 3 or 4 cabinets full of Great Northern kits, box cars, cabooses, different things that I want to build, which I love to build the cars and all. So there's always plenty to do and things to just keep active on and do what you enjoy. That's kind of what's nice about the layout. You can do work on the layout. When you get tired of that, bounce over and do some work on the equipment. So it's fun, but always run the trains. Enjoy that.
Gary, thank you very, very much for showing your layout to us.
Well, always happy to do that and enjoyed having you come. Hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to having you come back again.
In the mountains above Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, Jay Beckham is building a large Western Maryland-themed layout with some of the most realistic scenery that your host has ever seen. Assisted by scenery guru Warren Hart and using largely craft store and natural materials and framed with subdued lighting, the scenery on Jay's layout stuns on video and in person. Let's listen to Jay and Warren describe some of their techniques. Jay, thank you for letting us visit your layout. Today we have Jay Beckham, who owns the layout, and Warren Hart, who's responsible for a lot of the scenery. Can you tell us what is the theme of your layout?
The layout is based on the Western Maryland Railway in West Virginia and its connection with the Pennsylvania Railway in Baltimore, Maryland. It also includes a small portion of the Baltimore Transit System's trolley operations. The time period is the 50s. Western Maryland will be running steam and diesels, and the Pennsylvania Railway will be running diesels and electrics. The design is point-to-point with staging yards for the Pennsylvania Railroad. I have been a follower of John Armstrong and have tried to follow his basic design principles in this layout. As to operation, the Western Maryland will be hauling coal from the fictional line in West Virginia to Port Covington in Baltimore. Hoppers will be filled at the mines with a fake coal substance, and if port covered, then they will be dumped using a rotary dumper into a model ship. Also, coal will be hauled from Dubron, West Virginia to Bethlehem Steel in Baltimore. Bethlehem Steel owned coal mines in Kentucky. The C&O hauled it to Dubron and Western Maryland to Baltimore. Also, there will be some passenger train runs on Western Maryland as well as mixed freight. Pennsylvania Railroad will run through trains from the northbound station to Penn Station and southbound station. Both freight and passenger will be run. In addition to the Pennsylvania Railroad will run trains from Washington Station to Penn Station and then up the old Maryland Central tracks to Harrisburg and west. One of those trains was the Liberty Limited, and general operations will be controlled by a dispatcher using my full-size CTC board and its signal system.
You have a great layout under construction here. How long has this layout been in the works?
Up to about 1994, I was modeling the Pennsylvania Railroad Columbia and Fort Deposit branch in HO. After seeing an O-scale layout in Martinsburg, I got the O-scale itch. In 1994, I drew up plans for an O-scale model of the Chicago, South Shore, and South Bend Railroad and electrified railroad in Chicago. My reason was it ran from overhead like the Pennsylvania Railroad. It hauled substantial freight and passengers. I also wanted a signal system in the CTC. I did start on the 15 by 30 version and laid some track. Then in 1999, we purchased this house. It had a lot more room for a layout, and basically the 30 by 60 foot basement was completely open and ready for a green layout. In 2001, I drew up a plan for the South Shore and started construction. A few years later, around 2009, I decided to add a bit of mountain scenery to an otherwise flat layout. We created what is now known as Warren's Gap. I didn't like the look of rocks made from rubber molds. I sent a photo to Warren Hart. He came over and redid the area with hand-carved rocks. Over the years, half of the layout became our version of the Western Maryland Railroad. The South Shore portion lasted as such to 2012, when I gave up the South Shore and converted the portion of the layout to the Pennsylvania Railroad. From about 2006, I had one helper, Jim Withrow, and then in 2009, Warren joined the crew. Presently, I have 3 to 4 helpers. The bench work is usually Alberta with some of the road bed built of homosote spline, and other areas 3/4 inch ply and 1/2 inch homosote. Most of the track and switches were Atlas. There are some hand-laid track and switches. The basic control system is NCE DCC. The signal system in the CTC is Bruce Chubb's CMRI. Programming using Visual Basic was done by Bill Carr. Jim and I built 95% of over 200 plus circuit boards required. About 3,000 feet of wire under the layout. Our sound system is QSI. The trolley line, the PRR, will have catenary when all singing is completed, but it will be just for show. The bridges and trestles are scratch built, and so is most of the structures. Penn Station, for example, is mostly resin castings made from molds I made. The same is true with all the retaining walls and tunnel portals. However, some of the structures are ready to run out kits. Most of the future structures will be scratch built.
Western Maryland is a neat small railroad with big railroad features, so your switch to Western Maryland was a good choice. What will you accomplish with your switch to the Western Maryland?
The switch from the South Shore to the Western Maryland and Pennsylvania has its advantages and its disadvantages. The Western Maryland and the Pennsylvania Railroad are better known and have more local appeal. The contrast between the two is very interesting and sort of provides the best of both worlds. Backwoods operation is kind of neat and the structures are fun to build, but the Pennsylvania Railroad provides the fast trains and multiple tracks and lots of passengers. That said, the South Shore was my first love, and I miss it. But to be honest, until I moved to West Virginia, I had never heard of the Western Maryland. In the Washington area is B&O and Princeton, also the typical C&O, N&W, Southern, New York Central. Modeling those scales is difficult at times, but easy isn't always a good thing. However, I have found over the years O-scale, at least for me, is the only way to go. When I look at HO now, it seems like N-scale. I really like the bulk that O-scale provides, and the details are much easier to do. Now, if I were young and could do it all over again, I think I would have stayed with the South Shore. One of the reasons I changed was due to what I call flat land modeling. It just didn't seem easy to do, and nothing looked boring. but at the time, I had never heard of the work of Peel Solberg. He has modeled a flat-rolling railroad, and the scenery is great-looking and very realistic. But as the famous TV pastor Robert Schuller once said, turn your scars into stars. And that is what I'm trying to do. I envy model railroaders that find their true love early on and model it all their lives. John Armstrong said, look at and study lots of railroads, but then choose one and model it. I often tell people this layout is too big and too small. Too big to get everything done and too small to include all the things I would like to include.
What is your roster like, and where and how did you acquire it?
We have a relatively small roster. I have 3 painted and lettered Western Maryland locomotives. There is an H9, an I1, and a K2. Also waiting to be repaired, sound installed, paint, and decals are 3 RS3s and 2 FA2s. Also several GP9s, a steam switcher, and 2 small Plymouth pieces. For the Pennsylvania Railroad, there is GP9 and 2 2-rail GG1s, a 3-rail GG1, and wheels and body shell to make a 4th GG1. The locomotives run the gamut from Breas, MTH, Williams, Atlas, and of course Weaver. Some were purchased new, some used on eBay and at shows, and the remainder at an auction. I also have 8 South Shore interurban glass kits, which may be usable as commuter trains on the Pennsylvania Railroad because of the catenaries and their pantographs. Freight rolling stock and cabooses number about 100 at the time. A few are new, but most were used from various sources. I also have a bunch of passenger cars and kits in various conditions, which will yield 15 or so 70 or 80-foot cars, and a few shorter cars.
One of the first things I noticed on your railroad is the subdued lighting. It's always early evening on your layout. It's very effective for the mountain hollows of Western Maryland and West Virginia. Was this planned, or was this a fortunate accident?
I started with incandescent warm bulbs. Then we went to CFLs because they had the air condition the layout room even in the winter with the incandescent bulbs. But the CFLs are beginning to burn out and are being replaced with LED bulbs. I've always purchased 2700K because I like the warmth of them. I never used 4-foot fluorescent tubes because they were not dimmable. My plan was and still is to eventually have the main lights on a dimmer so as to run trains from daytime to nighttime. The whole point of the color temperature and the black fascia and balances was to achieve the black box look of a stage set.
Your layout still has lots of scenery to complete. With so much scenery on a large layout, your crew has pioneered techniques of doing scenery with craft store materials. Can you let us in on some secrets?
I'm sure Warren will provide a good deal of information on the subject of scenery. What I can say is, we use just about any product that creates decent looking scenery. We also use a lot of natural things such as dirt, rock, sand, cassia, and furnace filters. For example, cassia can be purchased online from large craft and floral supply houses. Buying it from the local florist may be possible, but a more expensive option.
Yeah, speaking of the Caspia, that's something that dates back to me, and I come to Jay about it years ago. My first layout was built in the 70s, and I used it in HO for its leaf structure for bushes. And when looking at O scale, I saw the Caspia, and I saw, well, here's a leaf structure that's correct for O scale. It's so hard, even with the knock leaves or things like this, to create a plant in O scale with correct leaves. And you may see from some of the stills that you can create this leaf structure that's really hard to do. Other basic materials I use, I'm very much a believer in natural clays. I actually use clays for pigments because they never fade. I use a lot of acrylics. The clays in particular for coloring rocks even, as opposed to using acrylics. I do occasionally use, where you need really intense color, I'll use a touch of oil sometimes. Basic scenery materials for me are a lot of natural materials. I read years ago in, I believe it was O Scale magazine, an editorial And it was making a statement really, and it said there's no place in O scale for ground foam clumps. And when I look back, I really agree with that. We use lots of ground foam because there's just some things you need ground foam for. We use a lot of static grass, boxes of static grass. Jay built a static grass gun that we used years ago. It still works great. I think it cost him $10. Natural, real materials. My water, I'm strictly a Mod Podge water person. I do a lot of moving water. You cannot do in resin good moving water, I don't think. I do a lot of Mod Podge water. I like doing water. I like doing rocks. I like doing ground cover. All the rocks that you'll see in the layout are all carved rocks. Carving rocks are just something that one learns to enjoy doing. Everybody's afraid of scenery, but that's one of the things I've enjoyed since the early 70s of carving rocks. Details, there's never enough detail. You can keep adding details, and I will go back into a scene and add little tiny bushes or little tiny, I'll go through and drill little tiny pinholes in and add lots of little more tree trunks, things like that. Talus along the slopes of the rocks. I use real natural rock, use all white glue as an adhesive. Diluted, I keep multiple bottles of white glue, one either diluted, one straight. The white glue is very permeable, sticks well to most anything in a diluted state, and once it's dry, it's clear, unlike the carpentry glue, which you use more for the carpentry, although it's always a water-soluble product. Vine-like vegetation, tend to use a lot of this fiber fill, like what you use for fish filters. It's dyed brown and used commercially in some of the hobby stuffs. Use a lot of that stretched out, and you'll see in the pictures on the layout there's a lot of that in use. And there's where we use a real fine ground foams of different colors with spray on adhesive or hairspray, all depending on what you're using. Weathering for me, I weather almost all acrylics in my rock works and scenery, and it's basically what looks good to one's eye. Our lighting is sort of subdued. We have certain colors that we deal with, and weathering is just strictly a feature of what the thing looked like in the first place. Okay, an interjection here on rock work. Thinking about lighting of rocks, I remember early along in model railroading, always used fluorescent work lights. And I'd try rock carving, and I said, boy, there's no detail to this. And eventually I changed to spotlighting and incandescence, where you're creating spotlights to create the work. Look at this when you're doing rock work with your shadowing, and try moving your light source. Just change the shadows sometimes until you find your proper light position. But this is just something I wanted to interject, that the lighting of carved rocks, cast rocks, any kind of rock work, any kind of scenery that is going to show detailing. Work with your light source and move it around and see what works the best.
People who have seen your layout all comment on the retaining wall. It certainly is spectacular, especially considering that it was constructed with common materials. Can you say something about it?
The retaining wall is not based on any particular location. Warren may have more to say about this and its construction, but basically a piece of masonite acted as a form for pouring the plaster. The river at the base is undergoing some changes. I'm using Viratex to give it more depth behind the dam. The water below the dam is also being changed some. I'm hoping to be able to lower it a bit so the dam will appear higher than the stream. It is an ongoing project at this moment.
Yeah, the retaining wall is to do an area, the typical train along the river with a mountain behind and not enough room to get everything in. You have the river, the railroad, and the mountain. We had to do a cut in the mountain and get tracks in above. We had the river right there and had no place really to model everything we wanted to model. But the typical train running along the river was going to be in an elevation. We needed to create something that had a little scenic effect. And I come up with, there's actually two pieces of the curved masonite to match the curvature of the road bed, and I think it's about 7-8 foot long, something like that there, and below it rapids, all done in Mod Podge. That the casting of the wall itself is basically a pouring process. I was trying to figure out how to make it look really old, because this is something that originally was done in the 1800s and worked on later and redone from an original stone wall and overfaced with concrete. And to do the cracking and so on to make it look that old was a little bit of work, but the secret to the cracking is to pour the base thick. If you pour it several inches thick, as it dries out, and in my first little pour in, it was a little too thin and started running out of seam, so I thickened it, and then you could create the actual cracks naturally as the thick material contracted. If you did it in, say, a 1-inch thickness, it wouldn't crack. So it had to be done at about a 3-inch thickness at the base of that wall to create the cracks. The coloring is a process of practice, like anything else. The more you look at the real thing and the more you study it, the more you can figure out maybe this is what's going to work best. I do everything from mixing little tiny bits of aggregate plastic glue resin into the mortar, or the hydrocal, actually in this case of this wall, to anything I can look at and think, well, what's going to work? I've even been working on now and trying to figure out how to do good rebar breaking out, but I can't find good O-scale rebar yet to do it. The colorations are many very thin coats over semi-dry or dry hydrocal with acrylics. One of the things that people do or make mistakes in, sometimes too thick or too heavy of a coat, the very thin washes work well. And with a hydrocal like plaster, as long as it's fairly dry and you don't overcoat it too early long, it'll even help harden it. The hydrocal wall there is hydrocal as opposed to plaster because of its size and longevity, and I wanted it to last.
If I remember correctly, the Western Maryland and West Virginia was dark territory, yet you're putting in an operational signal system. This is a significant scenic feature, is it not?
Yes, the Western Maryland was dark territory in West Virginia. But because I built the layer to the South Shore and planned and basically built the CTC and all the wiring for signaling and train detection, I decided to alter history a bit and include signaling for the Western Maryland as well as the Pennsylvania Railroad. The signals in Western Maryland are 3-color typical of most railroads. The signals on the Pennsylvania Railroad will be position light signals. West Virginia trains operating beyond Fulton Junction will be governed by Pennsylvania Railroad signals and rules. All signals are scratch built using a commercial target for the 3-color signals made in China and available on eBay. The rest of the signal parts and the Pennsylvania Railroad targets are castings I made or will be made from styrene. Both the Western Maryland and the Pennsylvania Railroad signals are operational and will control the operation of the railroad.
Jay, what's in the future for your layout?
The main line is basically finished except for the Fort Covington docks. We would like to finish it also. We have the whole area Balmer that will require hundreds of structures, streets, and details as well as the trolley line. Also needs several trolley cars and additional running stock. We plan to host operating sessions in the future using the dispatcher, CTC, and the signal system. I would also like to thank the many people who have helped to build this layer. I know of at least 12 people. We may have missed 1 or 2, but all of these people made some contribution to the layer over the many years the layer has been under construction.
Jay, thanks for letting us visit your layout.